पूर्णचन्द्रसुन्दरमुखम् ताम्रारविन्देक्षणम् भक्ताभीष्टवराभयप्रदकरम् कौपीनमात्रोज्ज्वलम् स्वात्मानन्दरसानुभूतिविवशम् सर्वानवद्याङ्गकम् श्रीमन्तं श्रीरमणेश्वरं गुरुवरं योगासनाध्यासितं ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणेश्वरम् ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणेश्वरम् ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणेश्वरम् हृदयकुहरमध्ये केवलं ब्रह्ममात्रम् यहमहमिति साक्षात् आत्मरूपेण भाति हृदि विषमनसा स्वं चिन्वतामज्जतव पवनचलनारोधा आत्मनिष्ठो भवत्वम्. Namo Ramana. We will commence today's evening Atma Vichara by listening to Bhagavan's Upadesha. We have been reading from the book Ramana Answers, Self-Inquiry 1900 to 1950, a compilation of all masters' answer on the subject matter of Atma Vichara, self-inquiry, by our founder President Sri A.R. Natarajanji. In the series of questions that we have been looking at it, we have reached question number 53 by Master's Grace. The question which has been put by the devotee is, a visitor is experiencing great difficulty in meditation. When he fights with what he imagines to be his ego, he went to the master for verification. Devotee, in my meditations, I tried to eliminate the wrong I, but so far without success. Bhagavan, how can I eliminate itself? All you have to do is to find its source and abide in it. Your efforts can extend thus far. I repeat the whole question. A visitor is experiencing great difficulty in meditation. When he fights with what he imagines to be his ego, he went to the master for verification. He puts a question. In my meditations, I try to eliminate the wrong I, but so far without success. Bhagavan says, how can I eliminate itself? All you have to do is to find its source and abide in it. Your efforts can extend thus far. Here, it is like I have taken a clean water and put a mud, and the whole water looks now very muddy. And what I am trying to do, as though I want to suppress all the mud so that the clear water which was there becomes available. And more I am making the effort to put my hand and suppress the mud, I am not able to understand that I am disturbing the mud and making the mud become more mixed with the water, and the water will look more muddy. But that is the only approach that I keep trying until I realize that my very approach is making the water more muddy. And then what I need to do is just remain still. Don't do anything with the water, don't do anything with the mud, and in time the mud kind of settles down and the clear water becomes available. So Bhagavan is saying here that how can the I eliminate itself? What I want to eliminate is what I am holding to be real and using it as the effort maker to eliminate itself. And that is never going to happen. What I want to remove, I am holding the same thing and I want to remove it. And that looks almost impossible. But I don't see that it is impossible by this approach. In fact, there are many stories Bhagavan gives that we take a similar approach in our sadhana. In the Chikitdwaja and the Chudala story, which Bhagavan says, he says very clearly, I don't remember who is Chikitdwaja and Chudala. One is the queen and one is the king, but you have to excuse me for that. But essentially, the queen is a realized person there, but the king, who believes that he is the king and he is very busy with all his kingly work, feels that he would have to take a lot of time he has to relinquish all his work, then go and do the tapasya in the forest and then realize the self. Whereas the queen will be saying, because she is a realized one, she would be saying that it is not necessary. But for the king, the queen is not a realized person. She doesn't look like a realized. She is just the queen of him. So he decides that on one fine day that he will hand over the whole thing to the minister to look after. He takes a retirement from his kingdom, goes into the forest and starts doing the meditation and the tapasya. The queen, who is very compassionate one, takes a form of a sage and keeps approaching her husband and guides her in his path of meditation. And about, I think, 5 years or 10 years, after which the king realizes the truth with the guidance of the queen. And at that end of the conversation, when the queen reveals herself to the king, she says that this you could have done it this realization could have happened amidst all of your activities in the kingdom itself. It is because that you decided that you have to relinquish everything and you have to realize the self, having retired into a forest. It took you 15 years. And that is what we also don't know, that we don't see that the very approach that I am taking it is kind of prolonging it. So Bhagavan is saying, how can the I eliminate itself? And with this, he is giving that clarity to us that the very approach that what we are holding on to, we have taken the snake to be real and using the snake image to realize the rope. So he is asking us to question that. So only when we eliminate the false thing which is not there as really not there, then what is there becomes always available. It was always there. Therefore, there was no effort required. And if at all I am saying I have to put an effort to know the self, that means we have accepted that self is not available right now. And therefore, by putting some effort, we are going to realize it. It is something very absurd in our approach that we don't see it. If the self is the truth and it was available, it should have been available all the time. In fact, that alone should be available because everything else is false and it is not there. The self alone would have been the who is the truth and it should be available here and now. This moment it should be available. When we recognize and put our faith that the self is available here and now, not the faith on the wrong thing, that the ego is true and I have to do something to realize. Instead of that, if I put the effort in what the master is saying, he says, go to the source of the I. When you try to go to the source of the I, which now you believe to be real, then the very source is that self. So the source of everything is the self. So just try to not go be in the surface. Try to go to the source. Try to go see what we refer to as I. And moment we do that, and we go back to the very self that we are, which is available here and now. And that is the only effort that we can extend, Bhagavan says. Because when we see that the self alone is at all times, and we go and abide in that self, which alone is, then there is no need to remove which was not there. It automatically drops off. It's our attention to what was not there was making it to be there. And once we turn our attention to that which is there and keep returning to it, then what effort is required to remove what is not there? Because it was not there to start with. And that becomes more and more clearer. It becomes as clear because of the grace of the self. More and more we make ourselves surrender to the truth which is there. The truth alone shines, the truth alone remains. Then the falsity doesn't need any effort at all. That it is that simple. So Bhagavan is giving us this direct path of Atma Vichara, wherein all we need to do is try to seek the source, inquire the source of whatever thought which is there, instead of thinking about the thought, which making that thought real and pursuing it. All we need to do is question the source of the thought, question the source of the I. And moment we question that and try to go to the source, then the falsity doesn't need to be attended. Nothing has to be done with it. And more we abide in that source, the less and less will be the strength of the false to delude us. The source alone becomes more and more clear, vivid, and palpable. So Bhagavan asks us to repeatedly dive to the source of the I and remain as that we already are. The self is the only reality. Self alone is, and there is nothing that we need to do to achieve it. All we need to do in case of sadhana is remove the reality that we are attributing to the false identification repeatedly. And with that, we get back, and by abiding in that which is there, this becomes more and more clearer. The immense grace of Bhagavan, who has given us this direct path to the self that we are, and to eliminate all the false identity which is not. With his immense grace, let us practice that Atma Vichara, that sadhana with full faith, recognizing that his grace will, by questioning to whom is this, who am I, we are knocking at his grace. In fact, his grace is coming in the form of this inquiry. To whom is this and who am I? and making us free of all the false identity that we try to hold on to. With the grace of Master, for the next 20 minutes, let us all do Atma Vichara. Namo Bhagavate Shri Ramanaya. Namo Ramana. Thank you. Over to Dr. Sharda Akka for talk on Ramana Gita about Atma Vichara.
Namo Ramana. Prostrations to Ramana, shining as a self in all beings. Today, Bhagavan has, in his answers, he showed us how the emphasis we are constantly paying attention to the limitation, even in the pretext of getting rid of it. So he says that we should pay attention to the source. Try to pay attention to the source. And we had seen that in the Ramana Gita also, in the Dhyana Shloka of Ramana Gita, the Muni, Ganapati Muni, emphasizes the wonder of the source. He brings out the beauty of the source in two ways. He talks about the path as the path of the river, and the source being the hill, the Himalaya, the king among hills, from which the river starts out. And the source also really being the Samudra, which is the heart of the devotee, he says. The hill from which this word, this Upadesha is coming is Ramana, and it takes the path of a river and gets one to the heart. So the way that we may take to go to the heart, what we do with the river, we may just sit by the bank of a river and look at the experiences, look at what's happening. So many things will be happening. Even if one watches a river simply, it is purificatory. It's just the way the water is constantly flowing and flowing and flowing. If one gazes at the river, this is something like we may be watching our thoughts without getting identified with them, in the sense, without getting carried away with them, without running with the running mind. As Bhagavan says in another context, he says, don't run with the running mind. So without doing that, when we watch, then we are not touched by the thoughts, and then even that process is purificatory. But what is actually required of us is to get back to the source. So how do we get back to the source? We could dip in a river and experience that which is ever there, everywhere, which is the water, which is the source. Or we could simply float on the river and allow the river to carry us back to the goal and the source, which is the ocean. And that is the river here being the purificatory words of Bhagavan. And he says that Prabala Malaharinyanupadam. Having said this, the Muni begins his work by prostrating to Bhagavan. Maharshim Ramanam Natva. Prostrations to Bhagavan. So whatever work we do, whatever effort we make, it has to begin with that, begin with Natva, with prostrations to Bhagavan. That's why repeatedly in the satsang we find, it could be Dilip or Nandakumarji or Venkatesh, they would all say, by the great grace of Bhagavan, or it might be Subramanyam. Whoever is taking the satsang would always say, by the great grace of Bhagavan, let us sit for self-inquiry. Let us start self-inquiry. So it is very important for us at the beginning of our effort, whenever we make effort, to offer the effort to Bhagavan by prostrating to him. Natva, Maharshim Ramanam Natva. I prostrate to Bhagavan Ramana, says the Muni. And what does actually prostration mean? Actually, Bhagavan says prostration means offering the ego itself. So when we offer the ego to Bhagavan, what else remains? Nothing would remain. But we are not able to offer the ego. Why? Bhagavan says, because it will be the ego which is trying to offer the ego. So don't try to offer the ego, but rather look for its source. So when we prostrate to Bhagavan, we are actually prostrating to the source. We are prostrating to the self. So Maharshim Ramanam Natva, says Muni, Kartikeyam Narakritim. He says he is Kartikeya, Skanda, the teacher among teachers, who has taught Brahma, who has taught Shiva, and who has come to teach the world. Skanda is known as the Guru. Murugan is the Guru Tattva. And therefore, Kartikeyam Narakriti. We look upon the teacher as God. We look upon the Guru as God. God, Guru, and the self are one and the same, says Bhagavan. So, recognizing that Bhagavan is the self, we begin the sadhana. We begin our inquiry by prostrating to Him who is the Supreme One embodied. Why the Supreme One embodied? Why do we remember Him as the Ishvara Shakti, as the Divine One, so that we can accept His ordainment? As Bhagavan has told his mother Aragamma, it is by the ordainment of the divine that all things are happening in accordance with one's actions. So, for us to accept the divinity, for us to surrender to the divinity, is a very important part of our practice of self-inquiry also. It is the turning to the source which Bhagavan referred to in the conversation that we were blessed with today. In the answer that we were blessed with today, Bhagavan says, try to turn to the source. That's all you can do. So we surrender to Bhagavan, we prostrate to Bhagavan. And how do we prostrate to Bhagavan? Physically, we can prostrate to Bhagavan by keeping a picture of Bhagavan in front of us. Or we can mentally have a picture of Bhagavan in our mind and prostrate to it. Or we can prostrate to the source which is the self. How does one prostrate to the self? One prostrates to the self by letting go of any separate rising of individuality. How does one let go of a separate rising of individuality? Because the individual cannot let go, isn't it? That's what Bhagavan is trying to say. He would say it's like trying to bury one's own shadow. If one starts an exercise of burying one's shadow, one may keep on digging a pit and putting sand on it, lot of sand. Bhagavan says one man dug a deep, deep, deep pit and he saw his shadow right at the bottom of the pit and he was very happy. It had gone to the bottom and he again put back all the sand on top of it. What happened? He found that the shadow was right on top. It had not been buried at all. It cannot be buried. So what does one do? How does one offer the prostration? That's why Bhagavan gives us the solution of self-inquiry. He gives us the question, who am I? When we ask ourselves the question, who am I? As Bhagavan says in Ulladu Narpadu, then Naan Thalai Saindidum. Even in Upadesha Saram, Upadesha Undiyar, Bhagavan says Naan Thalai Saindidum. Undi para. The ego bows its head. It actually prostrates to Bhagavan. This is Jnana Vichara. Naan Thalai Saindidum. When we ask ourselves, who am I? What is the nature of this mind? Then the I bows down its head. That is real prostration. So Maharshim Ramanam Natva. By prostrating to Bhagavan, by asking oneself the question, who am I? and thereby within ourselves allowing the ego to bow down to Bhagavan without any second thought, because of the power of the question, who am I? Without any further thought arising, it bows down its head. When it bows down its head, what does it recognize? It recognizes the divine source. நான் என்றொன்றது தானாக தோன்றிடும், Bhagavan says. So it recognizes Kartikeyam Narakati. This is the divine source. If we look at it from the perspective of self-inquiry, when the ego I bows down its head, when it dissolves, when it turns towards its source, the Aham Spurana reveals itself. Actually, David Frawley, one of the disciples of Ganapati Muni, had a mystical experience that Bhagavan is actually the Aham Spurana, and that is Skanda, that is Subramanya. Subramanya is the Aham Spurana. That was a mystical experience which he had, David Frawley had, when he was in the Arunachaleshwara temple. So, Kartikeyam Narakritim. So, when we turn down, when we turn the head within through self-inquiry, through the question, who am I? What happens is we recognize the presence of the Supreme. And this Aham Spurana, this link, is the link which is given to us by Bhagavan as a very special clue. He says this is the one which is the subtlest or the purest aspect of the manifest aspect of the self, and by being linked to the Aham Spurana, by remaining only with the Aham Spurana, the work in the world goes on through the Spurana, which is the state of Sahaja, as indicated by Bhagavan. So Muni says, this is Ramana Kartikeyam Narakritim. He has come in the form of a human being. It is the Aham Spurana, it is the Guru Tattva. Because this, who is the Guru? The Guru is the one who reveals the truth. And the Aham Spurana is what reveals the self to us. When we hold on only to the I, this Aham Spurana, it completely dissolves into the self. This is what Bhagavan tells us as the practice of self-inquiry. So, Kartikeyam Narakritim, bowing down to him, who is that Guru Tattva, that Aham Spurana, come in the form of Ramana. What do I do? By his joy, by his grace, Matam Tasya Prasannena, by his grace, by his love, I am putting it into the form of a work. I am binding it together. I am composing it in the form of a work, says Muni. And that is how all the works have come to us. That's what we saw. The word of Bhagavan. The word of Bhagavan, which has been codified and which has been documented, recorded, and put into the form of prose or poetry. That is the word which is being revealed to us. And that word actually is again the expression of the self. Bhagavan says the primary word is the Ekam Aksharam. That is the primary grantha which is ever shining. Hridi Nirantaram Bhasate. Swayam Bhasate. It is always shining. It is always shining, ever shining. And so the Muni says that I am putting together the entire Upadesha of Bhagavan. The entire Upadesha of Bhagavan always comes into any work which is dedicated to him. And any work which springs from him. Muni says this has sprung from him. Nagadhisha Srimad Ramana Muni Rupa. So it is coming from the words. This is the words of Bhagavan himself. And we find whether it is Guru Vachaka Kovai with thousands of verses, or whether it is the Ramana Gita with 18 chapters and 300 odd verses, and whether it is the Upadesha Saram with 30 verses, or whether it is the Appalam song with 5 stanzas and 1 Anupallavi, or whether it is the Eka Shloki Hridaya Kuhara Madhye, it always contains the entirety of Bhagavan's work. This is the beauty of Bhagavan's Upadesha. That every word of his contains the entirety. So here Muni says that entirety is being presented. Prasannena tasya prasannena grantheno paripadhyate. So we can look at the grantha, any grantha of Bhagavan, any work related to Bhagavan, by going into it extensively. We can also look at it by recognizing that whenever we hear even one word from Bhagavan, and when we savor that one word from Bhagavan, whatever that one word is, when we savor it, when we imbibe it, when we stay with it, with a lot of love, it reveals the entirety of the truth of his teachings to us. And then the Muni goes on to record when these questions were asked in each chapter almost. He will record the date of the chapter, the questions, because of his understanding of the immensity, the idea that people should not say this is not historical. Very many people say, oh, who is the only one who is in recorded history? The world teacher in recorded history, they want to know, you see. So the Muni records the date of the first conversation, which appears in Ramana Gita. He says that it happened on the 29th of December 1913. There is some beauty of the way it is recorded. Ishaputra Shake, that is in the year after Christ. Rama Bhumi Nanda Dharamite. So the way it is recorded is in the reverse. 1913 means it's recorded as 3191. Rama, there are 3 Ramas. So when he says Rama, that refers to the number 3. So 3 Ramas are there. And then Bhumi is 1. Nanda, 9 Nandas are there. And Dhara is again 1. So Rama, Bhumi, Nanda, Dhara. Mite, in that year, Ekona Trimshat. Trimshat is 30. 1 less than Trimshat, 1 less than 30, 29. Ekona Trimshat Divase Dwadase Masi, the 12th month, December, Masi Shitale, in the cold month, the 12th month. Then Upavishteshu Sarveshu Shishyeshu Niyatatmasu. All these devotees were seated and the questions were put to Bhagavan to give his conclusive replies, says Muni over here. Okay. Aprishtam Nirnayaptaye. I asked him for his conclusions. I didn't ask him for suggestions. I didn't ask him for directions. I asked him for conclusions. By using that word, Muni is telling us that when a word comes to us from Bhagavan, it is final. It is conclusive. There is nothing further for us to look at. When Bhagavan has told us something, we don't need to have any doubts about it. So, when Bhagavan tells us What is the nirnaya that he gives us again and again? What is the conclusion that he gives us again and again? He gives us the conclusion, Tirumbi ahandane dinamaha kankan teriyum yendranayan arunachala. Turn back to the source. Turn back to the source. It will be revealed. Turn to the source. It will be revealed. This is what Bhagavan is telling us again and again. Still, we have many doubts. Because we have many doubts, because our doubts keep rising from time to time in different forms, and because Bhagavan is compassionate enough to understand that the mind will come up with questions, it will come up with doubts. Therefore, he has answered so many questions. He has allowed so many questions to be asked of him, and he has replied. So we have this in the traditional form of question and answer. You see, the Upanishads are also in the form of question and answer. Our tradition in India is to have the teaching in the form of questions and answers. This question answer method is very beautiful because it emphasizes the importance of the question, and of course thereby gives us the importance of the ultimate question, who am I? Other questions are also allowed to the extent that they will support our understanding. They will clear the various other granthis, because we have many, many, many dark spots. We have areas we don't realize we are holding on to. We have questions we don't realize we have within us. So the great ones ask these questions on our behalf. They've asked these questions of Bhagavan because these are the questions which are most likely to come up for us in the course of our practice. So some of the questions are there, and in the first chapter there will be 6 questions which are asked by Ganapati Muni, and then Bhagavan's conclusions with regard to these 6 doubts will also be given in the first chapter. But here today Bhagavan has allowed us to dwell on the fact that what is important is to get back to the source, and getting back to the source is really to prostrate to Bhagavan. That is really getting back to the source, or real prostration is getting back to the source. So the bowing down of the ego surrendering to the self through the questioning, who am I, is true prostration to Bhagavan. And when one does that, then one recognizes that he alone is supreme, that he is the supreme one who takes care of the working of everything in this world. And as Sadhu Om Swami says, that if we understand this first, then there is no further sadhana required. Once we understand that he is in charge and he is in loving charge, he cares for every one of us. He loves us, and through that love, it takes care of us. When we recognize this and surrender to him, and then practice the conclusive path which he has given to us, with that faith, with that complete freedom that he is taking care, then Bhagavan says it will be revealed. That is his assurance to every one of us. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramana. Dilip?
Yes, Akka. Apar Satchit Sukhavarirashi Yasyornimatram समस्तं गुहाहितं तं रमणं गभीरम् चिन्ताविहीनं हृदि चिन्तयामि चिन्ताविहीनं हृदि चिन्तयामि नमो रमण. Thank you.